have a real special treat for you. Good morning, good morning. Can we call to order? Thank you. We have a real special treat for you this morning. We have two of the scions of the Marjorie Canan Rawlings Society here, brought together on one stage. For your viewing pleasure, we have Kevin McCarthy and David Nolan, and I forget who's going to be interviewing whom. I wish I could be here and interview them both, but Kevin will be interviewed by David Nolan about the history of the Marjorie Canan Rawlings Society, and you're in for a real treat. Thank you both for being here.
Thank you. Well, Kevin, I suppose as the most prolific author of Floridiana of our generation, you probably grew up, born and raised in Florida, probably in a rural area like Cross Creek. Would I be correct to assume that?
No, I'm from New Jersey. And I came down to the University of Florida in 1969 after earning a master's and PhD at the University of North Carolina. So I keep moving south. New Jersey, North Carolina. Next will be Key West.
And all of your education was not academic either.
No, I spent 2 years overseas in the Peace Corps. In 1963, at the height of the Vietnam War, I applied to the Army and the Peace Corps, War and Peace. And I told my parents whichever one came through first, I would go to the Army Officer Corps or the Peace Corps. In March of 1963, the Peace Corps said, "We want you, and we want you to go to Turkey." And I said to my mom and dad, "Where's Turkey?" I honestly had to go look on a world map, because you could choose which country you went to, but I didn't care. I just wanted to travel. So I spent 2 years in Turkey. The first year with 2 other Americans, and we spoke English all day long. The second year I was alone. So there were 40,000 Turks and me. So one result of that was I really learned to speak Turkish well, and even though that was over 50 years ago, I still speak baby Turkish. And the advantage of Turkish is it's wonderful for passwords. So I can use Turkish words that nobody knows. But one result was that my jaw began to hurt at the end of the first month when I was speaking only Turkish and baby English. Good morning, students. How are you today? And so on. My jaw was beginning to hurt, and I was forgetting my native language. So when I would write home to my family, the words did not come as quickly. So I knew I was really too long in Turkey. But I loved it. It was the best job I ever had, because I not only did I teach English to students in the daytime, in the evening I offered free courses to any adults who wanted to learn English. So for example, my best student was a carpenter, and he just loved the language. So almost every afternoon, 5, 6, 7 days a week, I would go to his carpentry shop to speak English. And there would be a break about 3 p.m. for prayer, and then he would come back and we would continue. And I went back about 20 years later, he was still in the same shop. And he was still learning English on a daily basis. So then I came back in 1965 and it began at the University of North Carolina.
And how did you wind up at the University of Florida? Was academic job hunting as difficult as it is today?
Yes, it was very hard. But because I was applying to English departments as a linguist, that I had some cachet. Interestingly, when I got engaged to be married around 1960, 70, the Washington Post had a picture of my fiancée. She was Miss Oregon at the time, but she was a pretty important person. And below her picture, there was the note, engaged to linguist. So at the reception at the National Press Club, they keep, we don't know what a linguist is, can you help us? So I came down, and as so many people in my generation thought, well, I'll be at the University of Florida for a few years, and then go on to Duke or Texas or Georgetown or something. But I ended up spending my whole career, 30 some odd years there. But while I was there, I took a break for a year and took my family to Lebanon. And there I spent a year on a Fulbright, representing the US government, teaching at a university. And then in the mid-'80s, I decided to go back. I really liked the Middle East. So I applied to go to Saudi Arabia. I thought for 1 year, but when I arrived, they had such an unusual job for me to do. I thought maybe I'll spend 2 years. So the job I was to do was to teach English a little bit, but to take their curriculum at the university in Riyadh, the capital, and make it more Islamic. And I was stunned as you are. And I said to the boss, I'm a practicing Roman Catholic. How do you expect me to do that? Oh, not a big problem. He said, we're people of the book, you're a people of the book. So I spent 2 years, after bursting out in laughter, I spent 2 years working on that project and just loving it. I just really like the Middle East a lot.
Now, I remember first meeting you, Kevin, about 45 years ago in Library West. Up on the top, they had Flo Turcotte's predecessor, Laura Monti, who did a wonderful collection of Marjorie's letters with Gordon Bigelow years ago. And I was going through Marjorie Rawlings' papers, and you were working on a literary map with Dr. Gary Harmon from the University of North Florida. Where in there between Lebanon and Turkey and Saudi Arabia did you acquire your fascination with Florida?
That's a good question. When I arrived in Gainesville in the late summer of 1965, I guess, I knew I had to publish or perish. As in academia, you need to write. But when my boss would introduce me at the university or at academic meetings, he would say, this McCarthy guy is a world expert in Arabic and Persian loanwords in modern Turkish. Wow. The reception from you emulated that of everybody else. How boring that must be to study loanwords in modern Turkish. So I decided one summer, I knew I had to publish. So I bought a pup tent, and I camped my way around the state of Florida, down to the Florida Keys, up to Pensacola, going to as many towns as I could. And when I would enter a town, I would find the local library, and I would ask anybody, even on the street, I'd stop a stranger and say, suppose I want to study the literature of this town, any authors who lived here, any movies that were made here, any literary personages who passed through or made their home here, well, where would I find a good resource? So I began to accumulate on my own lots and lots of information. So as David was referring to, I made a map, a bunch of maps, and this is the literary map that Sandra Parks gave to me yesterday. I made maps like this, literary maps of Florida, because I wanted it turns out my goal in life and as a career was, as a New Jerseyite, to convince other Northerners that there's a lot more to Florida than Disney World and Cape Kennedy and so on. It's just been such a joy. People have never made fun of me because I'm from New Jersey. Interesting, I had 2 claims to fame. When I was born in 1940, my brother was born at 8:10 p.m. on October the 15th. That's the good news. The bad news is I was born at 8:20 p.m. So I'm a twin. And my brother got the brains. He became an aeronautical engineer and developed, for example, a rocket ship that went around the solar system, measuring, are you all sitting down? Measuring what happened in the first millisecond of creation. That's a long time ago. 13.5 billion. He said we can measure that. We can measure the temperature, the expansion of the universe, and the speed of the universe, and so on. Anyway, he spent his whole career building rocket ships. But in the next bed from my mother up in Teaneck, New Jersey, was Harriet Nelson, the mother of Ricky Nelson. So from time to time, when I'm in the shower especially, singing, I think maybe they switched babies. You laugh.
Resemblance.
And then, pardon?
Quite a resemblance, I think.
Well, and then I went to school with a young man I was on a track team as a high jumper. And my buddy was a javelin thrower. And he set the record, the New Jersey record for throwing the javelin. He then got a scholarship to go to the University of Southern California to be on the track team to throw the javelin. He got hurt in his first semester, knew he could not make a career out of throwing the javelin. He decided to take an acting class. His agent said, his name at the time, my friend's name was Michael Horowitz. Does that ring a bell? Yeah. No, it doesn't. Very good. Who said that?
Ellen.
Wow.
Of course. Michael Landon.
Very good. Michael Landon. Oh, they chose Landon from the phone book. They just.
Yeah, they had it for professional reasons.
Yes. Very good. How do you know that? It's amazing. Anyway, so I went to school with Michael Landon at the time. So anyway.
Well, we just had a comment there from one of the original members of the Rawlings Society, and there's still a few scattered around here. But Kevin was really present at the creation. Will you share that origin of the Rawlings Society with us?
In 1985, a man named Phil May Jr., who was the son of Phil May Sr., who was the lawyer in the invasion of privacy trial of Mrs. Rawlings that took place in Gainesville. So Phil May Jr., who was a member of the Thomas Wolfe Society up in North Carolina, thought maybe we should establish a society to honor Mrs. Rawlings. So he went to Norton Baskin, the widower of Mrs. Rawlings, and said, what do you think? And Norton Baskin said, great idea. As a sidelight, there have been various books about people like, there's a new book out apparently by Sally Baskin, Booker, and books about Mrs. Rawlings. We have some wonderful authors here, and so on, and Barbara Spiesman wrote a play about her. But the only one that hasn't been written about is Norton Baskin. So we actually have here a person who really needs to write the biography for him. No pressure. So in 1985, Phil May Jr. came over to Gainesville, contacted historians Michael Gannon and Sam Proctor, and we met in the archives room of Library East. And there we had people like Michael and Sam, and we had a man who was a philanthropist. And we had a few people like Melvin New was my boss, the chairman of the English department. Interestingly, Melvin New and I are the only people still alive. Perhaps Jane, and she became the editor of the journal. So we decided to establish a society in 1985. It was finally established in 1987. As we sat around the table in the Library East, deciding who would do what, Phil May was the obvious choice to be president. Michael Gannon became the historian, and we had editor, Mrs. Adams became the editor of the journal. And then they said, anybody want to be the organizer of our annual meeting? Has anyone ever organized a meeting? And I sheepishly raised my hand and said I had organized a party for a group of linguists. So therefore they said, well, you're in charge of organizing it. So in 1987, we organized the society. In 1988, we had our first meeting of the society, and they made me by default executive director, which I did for 18 years. And then we decided various things, to have the meeting in a different place in North Florida, a place that was associated with Mrs. Rawlings in some way. St. Augustine was a natural, Jacksonville, Gainesville, even Cross Creek. And then we decided to have all-day Friday and then a Saturday meeting. Little by little, we got longer and longer in terms of the agenda. One of the highlights of each meeting was a boat ride. We even had one in St. Augustine here. Now, David's tour yesterday was comparable because it was so full of information and a delightful tour. And the other time when we met in St. Augustine, David gave a tour also of that, and it was just so mesmerizing because he was so full of knowledge. And I would say to him, why don't you write this stuff down? It's so interesting. And you may know his Houses of St. Augustine book. So about that time, I decided to forget all about Arabic and Persian loanwords and modern Turkish, and to concentrate on what I call Floridiana. And I looked at the WPA guide to the states, produced in the 1930s and 40s during the Depression. And as you may know, the WPA guides were mile-by-mile surveys of important places in every town, for example, in Florida. So I decided to see if I could do this for a literary guide to Florida. So I divided the state into 9 parts. And I found a person who lived in each of the 9 parts who agreed to write a literary history of that part of Florida. When Gary Harmon did the Jacksonville North, David did St. Augustine down to Daytona Beach over to Orlando. So we divided the whole state into 9 parts. And then my favorite book has always been John Steinbeck's. Remember John Steinbeck?
Baby.
What was the
Grapes of Wrath?
Grapes of Wrath. And I decided to make inter-chapters. So in the middle of each of these 9 chapters, there is an inter-chapter on the poetry of Florida, the eco writers of Florida, the literary luncheons. For example, down in Sarasota, there's a literary luncheon for years and years of famous people. And we did the science fiction writers of Florida. So this is, I've done a bunch of books. This is my favorite book. It's called The Book Lover's Guide to Florida. And David has a book, a copy of it someplace, and he has wisely contacted at lots and lots of meetings the authors. What do you do with these authors?
I get them to sign where they're mentioned, and that book is literally dripping with hundreds of signatures of a lot of people who are no longer with us and won't be signing anymore. But when I die, I have 2 children and a wife, and that's one of my special books that my wife will get because she's president of the Rawlings Society. And the other 2 books will go to the children who, as youngsters, used to go around with me and sell them when they came out. So that's one of the real treasures that I have.
Talking about your wife, I wonder if Darian would take off her clothes or at least her sweater. Just at least stand up. Keep your clothes on, but stand up. Marjorie. So there are wonderful articles about the 3 Marjories. Marjorie Kennan Rawlings, Marjorie Stoneman Douglas, and Marjorie Abrams. There's actually a 4th one.
No, Marjorie Harris.
Marjorie Carr. There's actually a 4th one. Marjorie Bartlett Sanger, who, not the birth control lady, Marjorie Sanger, but this is Marjorie Bartlett Sanger, who wrote books about Florida, lived in Winter Park, wrote a book about Billy Bartram, wrote a book about Escoffier, the French chef, and so on. She was a delightful lady that I interviewed in Winter Park. So I would go around and interview as many people as I could find, including Marjorie Stoneman Douglas. So I went down to Miami one time and rented a car and found her house in, I think, Coconut Grove, and spent an afternoon with Marjorie Douglas, who I think wrote one of the most important books in the history of Florida, Everglades River of Grass. Because not only did that book lead to the establishment by President Nixon of the Everglades National Park, but she also established Friends of the Everglades. When she was in her 70s, she established this Friends of the Everglades. When she was in her 80s, she wrote lots of short stories that have long been out of print, in which she gave me permission to reproduce and to copy. And then we put 2 books together of her short stories. In her 90s, she became head of the University Press of Miami. And finally, I think she died at about 106.
Yes.
Delightful woman. But when I interviewed her all afternoon one day, she was about maybe 4'8", maybe. And she used to go around, and she would say, speechifying. She loved to go before the U.S. Corps of Engineers, who would shudder when they would see her coming down the aisle. Little lady, big hat, but she felt so strongly about saving the Everglades, and she wrote that book. And she made it clear to me, young man, she said, don't waste my time. If I find you wasting my time, I'm going to throw you out of my house. So she was a delightful woman, and I thought, I'm in the presence of literary royalty because of how much she has done for the state. So you can keep your clothes on, Darian, but there really are 4 Marjories.
Well, you've had some interesting experiences with a variety of authors. I remember the popular movie Cool Hand Luke, you know, and the song, I don't care if it rains or freezes as long as I have my plastic Jesus riding on the dashboard of my car. And you have some interaction with the family connected with that.
As you know, the author of Cool Hand Luke was a man named Don Pierce. I one time had a proposal to write a book called 15 Contemporary Florida Authors. 15. And one of them was to be Don Pierce. Oh, I interviewed Don Pierce, and I said to him, and I showed him the essay I wrote about him. I said, I thought your Cool Hand Luke book was very good. I thought your short stories were really quite good also. But I said, you wrote 2 books that were awful. One was about how to die in South Florida. And the other, and I'll try to clean this up a little bit, the other was about sailors at sea and what they do when they find a mannequin, for example. So I said, these are awful books. He got so mad at me, he said, if you publish this essay about me, I will break your knees. Now this is an ex-convict talking to me. So I said, well, phooey on you. So the 15 contemporary Florida authors became 14 contemporary Florida authors. And one final anecdote about him. Don Pierce had spent his career in the Merchant Marine. Really liked the sea. Had 3 sons. Named his sons, do anybody know? Anchor, Rudder, and Hawser. Well, one time in Gainesville, I was getting my chimney cleaned, and I said to the young man, what's your name? He said, my name is Anchor Pierce. So I said, I know your father. I didn't say what our But when each of these 3 boys, Anchor, Hawser, and Rudder, turned 21, Don Pierce gave each of them enough money to go down to the Fort Lauderdale City Hall and change their name. But none of them changed their name. They're all still the nautical themed people. But Don Pierce is not in this book that I wrote.
Now, there are a few obvious places connected to Marjorie to have an annual meeting, but you did it for 18 years. Were you hard-pressed to come up with locations?
I realized after a while it was very difficult to find places. The one place I really failed miserably, much to Roger Tarr's annoyance, was Key West. Every year he would say, let's have a meeting in Key West of our Rolling Society. And I would contact the people down in Key West at the hotels, and they would not cooperate at all. They said, we don't need your group. We have enough tourists all year round. One of the differences now, the organization is so really well organized now with Flo and Ashley and Ann. The difference was I'm not a good delegator, so I ended up doing all the stuff myself. I enjoyed it so much. So I would contact the hotels ahead of time and say, we want to meet, we may have 50, 60, or 100 people meeting next year in Mount Dora, or in St. Augustine, or in even in Fernandina, Cedar Key, Apalachicola. What can you give us for a good hotel rate? And I would bargain with them that way. Nobody knew the venue of next year's conference till the final minute of the previous year. I would say, oh, by the way, next year we're going to meet in blank. And I would announce Cedar Key or Fernandina Beach or so on. But it was really fun not only to go to places like Apalachicola, so we could call on local authors there. I called on a man I knew, Jack Rudlow, an environmental writer who once took me for a whole day alligator hunting in the Panhandle. But Jack was a really strong environmental writer. in Panacea, Florida, and he was our speaker. But it was always fun to get speakers for our meeting, and they were always so delightful. Like Gary Mormino last evening, we had him one time. But other than Key West, we try to meet someplace in North Florida that was relevant to Marjorie. And in all the meetings, in 35 meetings, I missed one. The one up in Asheville. I just couldn't get away that weekend up in Asheville. But, I mean, I'm sure all of you have been to a lot of meetings. And let me tell you a couple of things about some of the people involved. One of the most interesting people we had as the president was a lawyer from Jacksonville named Bill Jeter. He is one of the most honest people I've ever, I mean, I know all lawyers, Terry, are very honest and trustworthy. But Bill Jeter was absolutely amazing. And one of the things he did as president was, he did something we had never seen before. He brought a machine with him that was full of bird sounds. He had contacted Cornell University and talked to the people up there in bird studies, got a tape of Florida birds, winnowed out the birds that Mrs. Rawlings mentioned, gave us a quiz, which I failed miserably. But some of our members who were so smart were able to recognize the sounds of the birds from the tape and write down the answer. Bill lived on Drayton Island, which is, anybody know where Drayton Island is? Okay. It is the largest island in the St. Johns. It is at the northern edge of Lake George, near Georgetown, south of Palatka. And one time, Bill had the trustees meeting at his house on Drayton Island. So none of us had a boat, so we all went up to Georgetown, and he and his delightful wife, Deanne, and another member of our group, Walt Graham, shuttled the trustees back and forth from the mainland to his house on Drayton Island, and had a really wonderful meeting of the trustees there. As a sidelight, Walt Graham was a man who lived on Drayton Island, was a long-time member, was very involved in the plaques, like Paul Dunn is doing now, and Claire Gauchard. Walt did a lot about the plaques. For years, Walt would say to me, why don't you do a book about Drayton Island? Finally, after he nagged me for maybe 10 or 15 years, I decided to go over and spend a weekend with him. It happened to be the coldest night of the year. He had no heat in his house, but I had a sleeping bag, and we toured the island together. And I wrote a book about Drayton Island. Now, I need to warn any of you who ever have the idea of co-authoring anything with me, hesitate. Almost all my co-authors, other than David, have died. Within a year or two after they do it, they die. And so I've done books on Micanopy and Lake City and Waldo and Cedar Key, and all my co-authors have died, so don't.
Now, what everyone wants to know, Kevin, is exactly how many books have you written?
Well, I've done 77. I just turned 82, so I want to do 82, but that's maybe the book about Sally Baskin Hooker maybe my last one. But I want to give each of you a homework assignment to begin tomorrow morning when you wake up back in your home. Sit down at your word processor, your typewriter, your long yellow pad, and begin to write your memoirs. I feel so strongly about this. Now you may say, oh, my life is so boring, nobody would care. Somebody will care. Long after you and I are gone, somebody would wonder about who you were, where you went to school, why you lived in Florida, and so on. I go around the state of Florida talking to anybody who will listen to me about writing your memoirs, because it's just so important. And nowadays, with word processing, it is relatively easy to publish. I have abandoned university presses because I don't enjoy working with them. It takes too long to get a book out. And now I can do it with Amazon very cheaply, for free in fact. And if you're ever interested, just call me and I'll walk you through the process. There are different word processing programs to make a book. One I really enjoy is a one-word company called InDesign, InDesign, and they will do a book for you. They will give you an ISBN number for free, which you must have in order to sell this in any bookstore. And it's so easy to write and to produce these books now. The one thing I learned was to try to put a picture on every page. So if you look up any of the books I've done, I've got a picture on every page, because I, perhaps you, love to look at pictures. And therefore, and let me give you a source of pictures. The Florida State Archives in Tallahassee has over 100,000 black and white photographs that are free. If you access the Florida Department of State and then look under photographs, you can download these for free. 100,000. Anything dealing with Florida you will find at that site.
Well, Kevin, you've written about everything from Florida lighthouses to Florida outhouses, and from baseball on down. Is there anything that you've wanted to do that you've been frustrated in doing?
No, I'm not a great thinker. I love to write books that interest me. So, for example, I've gotten interested in African Americans in Florida. So I've written 6 books about the subject, and I've gone around giving talks in black churches about the subject. And I've done books on, as David said, on baseball, on shipwrecks, on pirates, on Greek people of Florida, alligators. I mean, the other night when we were at the alligator farm, I was looking to see if they had a book called Alligator Tales, which I did with John Moran, the photographer. So another member of our group is Jim Stevens. He lives in Cross Creek and Rock Creek Park in Gainesville. He and I did a book called Hammock Happenings, organizing all the columns he had done on what it's like to live in Cross Creek. And then about 2 years ago, I said, why don't we do a book on Orange Lake, on which he lives, and where Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings gigged for frogs, and where she fished, and the Orange Lake has floating islands. One of the few places in all of America where you will see islands that float, and they could be as big as an acre in size. There could be deer on these islands, and when you wake up in the morning, you may see your property is much bigger than it was the previous day because an island has come in. But no, and I just, anything dealing with the state of Florida, I like to write about. And I got a lot of my ideas from, for example, Texas. I used to subscribe to Texas Monthly Magazine, and they used to write about anything about Texas, the flowers, the history, the Texas Rangers. So I would get ideas from these places. So.
Well, one of the treats in the early days of the Rawlings Society was that we would be in the middle of a meeting and along would come an entourage. And it would be Idella Parker and a couple of her sisters and maybe a niece and a nephew. And then along would come Desi Smith Prescott and, with a shillelagh that would beat off an alligator, I'm sure. And Jake Glisson would come, and this was like stepping into Rawlings history. And one of my great frustrations was that over a period of about 30 years, there were a lot of people who were going to do a book about Desi. And one by one, they produced nothing. And it went on decade after decade until finally we needed a closer, right? And who was that closer?
Yes, we have Margaret Harris. Where's Margaret? She's right here. She's a delightful person. And she is a close friend of Candace. What's Candace's last name?
It's Candace Booth Valderrama. She got married to Gus.
Okay, Candace. I know her as
But we
Candace.
spent 2 days interviewing her and going through the papers.
Candace Booth lived in Desi's house, where we actually met one time of the trustees over there near Crystal River. And Desi was a delightful person. And I remember one of the things she told me was, I think she was married 5 times.
6.
6 times.
She divorced 5 of them and buried the last one.
And and Desi would know within a couple of days whether this was the right marriage or not. And she wasn't going to waste her time. So she would quickly divorce the guy. But Desi was an amazing woman. She had one of the first pilot's license for a woman in the state of Florida. She was a licensed professional guide for fishing. She would take people to Alaska and Montana to go hunting. But Desi was a delightful person, and she was a pack rat. And she would collect in lots of stuff. And she and Candace allowed me to take this stuff and keep it for a while, and then write the story of Desi. And that's the kind of stuff I do. I don't like to spend more than a year on a project. I get so bored after about a year. I know some of you are much more profound than I will ever be, and you take longer to write. Perhaps Bob's books on rock and roll and so on will take longer than a year, but after a year I get so bored with the books that, anyway, Desi was a delight to do.
Well, when I came in this morning, Flo took me aside and said, you know, Kevin has done so much over the years to honor people in the Rolling Society, and we should do something to honor him. So would you please present him with this small symbol of our affection?
In appreciation for your dedication and service, Roger Kinnan Rolling Society. And it is a really nice pen. Wow. So I'll use this as I continue to do my writing. Thank you.
And could I get you to do the first of that pen to autograph a copy of the autobiography of Kevin McCarthy?
Another advantage of doing an autobiography, as I have done with this one, is that when your acquaintances, your children, your close friends say, where'd you go to school? When did you meet your spouse? And I say, if you had read my book, you would know all about it.
Buy the book.
So this goes back to the beginning when I was born in 1940 and so on up to the present. It doesn't have all my nicks and all my zigging and zagging. You may read this and say, boy, he's a saint. But I wasn't a saint. Anyway, again, the book has lots of pictures in here. I try to put a picture on every page. But you can do this too, as easily as I can do it, if you're interested. And there are people that can help you, and who can help you put together formatting. The formatting is hard to do, but let me strongly encourage you. Anyway, this is my autobiography. It really was fun to do.
Is that available here?
It's on Amazon right now. I pulled it up.
Oh.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear.
Amazon.
The book is, it talks about all the things. Again, I spent most of my career in Gainesville, but I spent 5 years in the Middle East. I've gone to Spain 4 times to teach a week at a time in a program teaching English to business leaders of Spain. I've gone to Hanoi, Vietnam twice to teach the Vietnamese English and so on. I really enjoy teaching, and when I was at UF, I was a grammarian. And I say that because when I would say that, people would invariably zip their mouth. Meaning I can't speak in front of you because you're an English teacher. But the only people I ever correct are my children and my students, so don't worry. Anyway, do you have any questions for?
Where they filmed Cool Hand Luke from?
Do you know where they filmed Cool Hand Luke from?
No.
God knows.
But if you had read the Book Lover's Guide to Florida, you would probably have found that information in there.
Kevin, I think I'm your long lost son. I really do. Everything you kept saying, it was just, I walked the grounds of the road prison where Don Pierce was incarcerated. And it's right there along 19 in Lake County. And there was even the remains of the warden's house and what I thought was the box. And I called him up, and he was one of the most cantankerous people I'd ever tried to interview. It never happened, but now with your information, I understand why. It was just, maybe I should have told him my name was Anchor.
If you ever do see Don Pierce, I think is he alive still? Don't mention my name. But I work with, for example, I work with Harry Cruz, who was probably more famous outside of Florida than he is in Gainesville or in the state of Florida. I remember, Flo, as you organized this meeting, I would love to share you one quick anecdote. I once organized a meeting of English teachers from around the state of Florida. We had maybe 200 teachers, and Harry was to be my main speaker on a Saturday morning. Was to be. So I stood up and said, well, our next speaker is to be Harry Cruz. I don't know where he is. At that moment, he was on his way in his car to southern Georgia, where his family was from. When I saw Harry on Monday, I said, Harry, you were supposed to be at my meeting. He said, I didn't want to go to your dumb meeting. So I said to this audience, and luckily, Flo, you've never had this problem, I hope. I said, audience, I'm really embarrassed. Our next speaker was to be Harry Cruz. He's far away. Can anybody help me? And this one fellow I had never seen before raised his hand and said, I'll help you out. And I said, well, who are you? He said, I am the great-great-grandson of William Wordsworth, the poet. So he regaled us for an hour about his great-great-grandfather and writing poetry in England and so on. So I hope you never have a speaker that would show up.
That's a good stroke of luck, anyway.
Thank you so much, Kevin. Any hesitancy you have is not worth doing. That was wonderful.